He made a childhood promise to marry an alien girl, sealing it with a starbound vow that fused their souls across light years. Now 15 years later, that vow has become a living beacon pulling him back into danger. The Galactic Triumvirate marked her people for extinction, but he's breaking every law to find her. What happens when a fairy tale promise collides with galactic oppression? Faradon 9 kept its beauty behind electrified fences and warning signs. The quarantine zone began where the colony's paved roads ended. Beyond those barriers, a thick jungle hummed with invisible life. Glowing pollen drifted on air currents. Crystalline trees refracted light into sharp patterns. For a 9-year-old boy from the sterile colony sectors, this was more than a restricted area. It was a living puzzle. Imperial patrols swept the perimeter daily. Their hovercraft cast long shadows over the boundary markers. They carried energy rifles and scanning equipment. The official bulletins called the wilderness contaminated. They listed biological hazards and unstable terrain. But the jungle did not feel dangerous to a curious mind. It whispered. It drew you in. The hum was a low, constant vibration in the ground. The air smelled rich and heavy. It was nothing like the filtered, recycled atmosphere inside the colony domes. Cale Arden found a gap in the western fence line. It was a small tear hidden behind a fallen rock spire. He slipped through without a sound. The ground felt different under his boots, soft, alive. The air tasted of ozone and wet soil, of something older, something decaying. Light filtered down through the canopy in broken shafts. It caught on floating spores that glowed with a soft blue light. He moved deeper, following a path of smooth stones. They were too even, too placed to be natural. The ruins emerged from the foliage gradually. Moss-covered arches, structures carved from a single piece of jet-black rock. They bore no symbols he recognized. No human design. They were silent. They held a stillness that felt watchful. This was not a dead place. It was a waiting one. This part of the jungle was older than the human colony. Older than the Triumvirate's claim on the system. The ruins were a testament to a civilization that had risen and fallen long before humans ever reached the stars. They were a secret the Empire seemed intent on burying, or controlling. The official logs never mentioned them. The patrols never ventured this far in. Cale's foot brushed against a vein of crystal embedded in the soil. It pulsed with a soft internal light. He knelt, fingers hovering above its surface. The energy it gave off was warm. It felt like a heartbeat. This was the freedom the colony could never offer. Raw, unfiltered, real. But the Empire had quarantined this world for a reason. Beauty often concealed a threat. Wonder could be a precursor to danger. He did not know it yet, but his curiosity had already crossed a line. The patrols were not just enforcing a boundary. They were guarding a truth, and he was walking straight into the heart of it. Every step took him further from the safety of regulations, further into a story that was much larger than a boy's adventure. The rustle of leaves ahead was not the wind. It was too deliberate. A shifting of weight. A presence. Cale froze. His hand fell away from the glowing crystal. The hum of the jungle seemed to sharpen, to focus. This was the moment his path changed. The frontier was not just a place of freedom. It was a place of convergence, where a child's innocent exploration would meet a destiny draped in shadow and starlight. He heard a soft step behind him, not an animal. Too light for that. Cale turned slowly, his boots crunching on the crystal-dusted ground. She stood between two ancient pillars, half in shadow. The fading light caught the edges of her form. Her skin held a deep blue tone, but it shifted. It moved through shades of indigo and violet as she breathed. It was like watching water under a changing sky. She did not look human. Her grace was different, fluid, unbroken. Her eyes were the color of polished mercury, but they held more than reflection. They held depth, a sense of vast distance like looking into a starfield. Her hair fell around her shoulders. It seemed woven from fine strands of light. It caught what little illumination reached the forest floor and held it. She was young, perhaps his age, but her presence carried a weight that felt ancient. Cale did not move. His breath caught. This was not in any colony field guide. This was not something the Triumvirate had ever described. Fear held him first. The drills, the warnings, unknown life forms were to be reported. Never approached. But fascination followed. She made no aggressive move. She did not bare teeth or raise hands. She simply watched him. Her expression was calm, curious. She was the last of her kind on this world, the only one who had not been captured or fled, a living piece of a culture the Empire was systematically erasing. Her existence here was an act of defiance, a quiet rebellion against extinction. She took a step forward. The movement was soundless. Her feet barely disturbed the leaf litter. Kale's heart hammered against his ribs, but he held his ground. She extended one hand, palm open, fingers relaxed. It was a universal gesture, one of peace, of greeting. Her skin continued its slow color shift. Blues bled into soft purples. It was hypnotic. He could see the fine patterns on her arms now. Delicate lines like constellations mapped onto her skin. He glanced behind him, back toward the fence line, back toward the world of rules and patrols. Then he looked at her again. Her silver eyes held his. There was no threat in them, only a quiet loneliness. A question. He lifted his own hand. Slowly. His movement felt clumsy compared to hers. Human. Earthbound. Their fingers did not touch. Not yet, but the space between them felt charged. Alive. This was the first moment. The first breaking of the greatest law the triumvirate enforced. No contact with classified species, especially not those marked for removal. Yet here they were. Boy and girl. Human and Lunari, in a forgotten ruin on a quarantined world. She smiled. It was a small thing, but it changed her entire face. The galaxies in her eyes seemed to brighten. Kale's fear evaporated, replaced by a feeling he did not have a name for. Not then, she lowered her hand and turned, glanced toward a narrower path that wound deeper into the ruins. Then she looked back at him. An invitation. Without words, he nodded just once and followed. This meeting was the start of something. 10 days of hidden moments, of shared silence and whispered stories. It was the foundation. The first stone laid in a bond that would have to stretch across light years and through time. It began here, in the twilight, with an extended hand and a choice to follow. Era spoke of her people in the quiet spaces between their explorations. Her voice was low. It carried the weight of memory. The Lunari were not warriors, she explained. They were mediators. They moved between star systems on vessels of light and intention. Their purpose was to prevent conflict, to calm rising tensions before they turned violent. They did not carry weapons. Their tools were understanding and a deep connection to the fabric of space itself. They could sense disturbances in the relations between species. They acted as stabilizers. As guides, this role made them respected. For a time, they built no empires. They claimed no territories. Their influence was soft. It flowed through diplomacy and mutual accord. But such power attracts the wrong kind of attention. Their peaceful nature became a vulnerability. During the War of the Twin Suns, the great powers turned on them. The factions they had tried to pacify saw their neutrality as a threat. Their ability to soothe aggressive impulses was recast as a weapon, a means of control. They were accused of psychic manipulation, of subversion. The exodus began under fire. Era described ships burning in the void, families scattering across the galactic rim. Clans that had lived for generations on crystalline worlds were torn apart. They became refugees in a universe that had once welcomed their counsel. The routes they had used to keep the peace became paths of flight. Their history was erased by the victors. Their accomplishments were turned into propaganda. They were painted as dangerous manipulators, a threat to galactic stability. The Triumvirate's laws solidified this new reality. Official decrees classified the Lunari as unstable specimens. Their psychic gifts were labeled biological hazards. Their culture was designated for study and containment. Interaction with them was forbidden. The laws were clear, harsh. They were not to be approached, not to be communicated with. They were to be handed over to imperial authorities if found. The punishment for hiding them was severe. The Empire was not just hunting them, it was rewriting their existence into a footnote of danger. Era's voice would grow quiet when she spoke of the hunters. They are still looking, she would say. Her eyes would lose their starry depth for a moment. They would become flat, fearful. They have ships that can track our energy signatures. They do not take prisoners for long. Her small form, usually so composed, seemed to shrink. The proud legacy she described stood in brutal contrast to her present. She was the last of her clan on Veridon 9, a living piece of history hiding in ruins. A child shouldering the fate of her entire species. Kale listened. He learned the reasons for her caution. Every snapped twig in the forest became a potential threat. Every distant hum of a patrol craft meant more than a routine sweep. It meant discovery. It meant the end. Her need for secrecy was not paranoia. It was survival. The Empire did not want to understand her people. It wanted to erase them, to dissect them, to extinguish the light she carried within her. This knowledge settled in him. It was no longer just about an unusual friendship. It was about injustice, about a quiet genocide happening in the shadows of the Triumvirate's glorious expansion. His simple desire to protect her gained a new dimension. It became a silent rebellion, a personal stand against a machine of oppression. He saw the fear in her eyes when a sound echoed too loudly. He saw the way she melted into the shadows at the first sign of movement. He understood why, and that understanding forged his resolve into something harder, something lasting. He would keep her safe, not just from animals or the wild, from the true hunters, the ones with ships and laws on their side. Their days fell into a rhythm of quiet discovery. Era showed him how to read the forest, how to follow the light trails of glowing insects to find fresh water, which fruits were safe to eat. She taught him the names of constellations in her own tongue, words that felt like music. Their bond grew in those shared silences, in the unspoken understanding that this time was borrowed. Each moment felt fragile, precious. One afternoon, as they sat in the hollow of a great tree, she grew quiet. Her usual calm seemed to shift into something more solemn. She looked at him with those star-filled eyes. "There is a way," she said. Her voice was softer than usual, a way to make a promise that the universe itself will remember. She called it a starbind vow, a celestial contract. It was an old Lunari tradition. From before the Exodus, it could tether two souls to each other. Across any distance, across time itself. It was not done lightly. She explained the ritual. It required physical touch, a direct connection, skin to skin, no barriers, and words, ancient words that held power in their vibration. The vow would create a link, a permanent thread in the fabric of reality connecting them. It would allow them to feel each other's presence, to sense direction and emotional state across the void. It was a bond for life, unbreakable. She warned him it was a serious thing, a weight, not a game. Kale listened. He was 9. The full implications were beyond his grasp. The concepts of light years and cosmic energy were abstract. But her seriousness was not. He understood that she was offering him something real, something from her world. He looked at her, at the hope and fear in her silver eyes. He thought of the patrols, of the hunters she had described. He thought about leaving, about never seeing her again. The idea was a cold stone in his stomach. His child's mind reached for the only framework it had. The stories, the fairy tales his mother had read to him. Knights and promises and happy endings. He nodded, his face set with a determination that was too old for his years. "Okay," he said. "I promise. When I'm grown up, I'll come back. I'll find you, and I'll marry you, just like in the stories." The words were simple, sincere. She took his hands in hers. Her skin was cool, smooth. The color shifts under her skin seemed to intensify, to pulse in time with her heartbeat. Or maybe his. She began to speak. The words were not in any language he knew. They were low, melodic, they felt ancient. The first phrase she taught him to repeat. "Across the void beyond time's measure," she said. He repeated it. His voice was small in the vastness of the jungle. The air around them grew still. The constant hum of insects faded. It was as if the world was holding its breath. The ritual was not long. A few lines exchanged, a mutual agreement sealed in touch and sound. But the effect was immediate. A warmth spread from where their hands joined. It traveled up his arms, settled in his chest. It was a feeling of connection, of rightness. He felt a new awareness in the back of his mind, a quiet presence that was not his own. It was her essence, her light. They were no longer two separate beings in a forest. They were linked, a promise made tangible, a bond forged in the innocence of childhood yet carrying the weight of the cosmos. It was done. The vow was sealed, a sacred treasure hidden in the heart of a boy, waiting for its time. The moment the final word was spoken, the air changed. It thickened, lost its transparency. The space around their joined hands seemed to warp. Light bent in ways it shouldn't. The edges of the world blurred. It was like looking through old, flawed glass. The jungle sounds died away completely, replaced by a low hum that came from nowhere and everywhere at once. It vibrated in their bones. Their skin-on-skin contact was no longer just touch. It was a conduit. Something flowed between them. A current of pure energy. It was warm, insistent. It traveled up Kale's arm, a wave of sensation that was neither pleasant nor painful. It was just immense. He felt a door open in his mind, a connection snapping into place with the finality of a lock engaging. He was no longer just himself. A part of him was now tied to her. A thread of his consciousness stretched out and anchored itself in her being. The energy did not simply pass between them. It fused. Human and Lunari essences met and merged on a fundamental level. It was not a blending. It was a binding. Two distinct entities becoming a single unit across two separate bodies. He could feel her heartbeat as a second rhythm inside his own chest. He could sense the cool, star-filled flow of her thoughts. They were one being now. A compound entity. A partnership written into the fabric of reality itself. Her voice was the only clear thing in the warping air. She spoke the final line of the incantation. Her words were steady despite the energy moving through her. Distance fades, but bonds remain. Love endures through joy and pain. The words hung in the charged air. They felt true, absolute, a law of the universe being stated aloud. The energy around them pulsed in time with the syllables. Then it settled. The humming faded. The light returned to normal. The world snapped back into focus. She looked at him. Her silver eyes were wide. "The ritual is complete," she said. Her voice was soft. "But you must understand. This bond is a beacon. It can be felt by others. The hunters. They have ways of sensing such things. This makes you a target as well." Her expression was serious. She had given him a gift, but it came with a cost. She had tied her fate to his, and in doing so, had placed his life in the same danger as her own. Kale looked down at their still joined hands. He could still feel the echo of that energy, the new awareness of her presence in his mind. It was a comforting weight, a certainty. He met her gaze. He did not hesitate. "I don't care," he said. The words were simple, direct, a child's unwavering faith. He squeezed her hand gently. "Teach me what it means. Teach me how to feel it." His childhood promise was no longer just words. It was no longer a fairy tale idea. It had been transformed, forged in that energy exchange into a celestial contract. It was binding, enduring. It would not break with time or distance. The triumvirate could create laws. Hunters could patrol the stars. But this was a force older than their empire. A vow written on a level they could not legislate. The feeling of her energy merging with his was visceral, unforgettable. It was like a piece of the night sky had taken root inside him. A cool, constant star glow next to the warmer, more chaotic pulse of his own human spirit. It was a sensation he would carry for the rest of his life. A touchstone, a memory written in light and blood. She finally pulled her hand away. The physical connection broke, but the deeper one held firm. "You must go now," she said. "But remember this feeling. Remember me. Return when you are ready. When you are strong, the bond will guide you. It will always guide you." Her words were not a plea. They were an instruction, a statement of fact. The starbind was complete. It was no longer an abstract ritual. It was the origin point. The fixed star around which both their lives would now orbit. A shared fate. Sealed in the quiet of a forbidden jungle with the weight of the unknown galaxy pressing in around them. The first sign was a chemical stench that blotted out the jungle's natural smells. It rolled in from the east, a yellow haze that killed vegetation on contact. Leaves curled and blackened. The hum of life fell silent. Then came the roar of engines. Not the familiar patrol craft. These were larger, heavier. Gunship-class vehicles with the triumvirate insignia stark on their sides. They descended through the canopy, their downdraft whipping the dying trees into a frenzy. They did not land. They hovered. Ramps dropped. Armored figures rappelled down on thick cables. The operation was swift, brutally efficient. It was not a search. It was an extraction, a termination. The agents moved in coordinated sweeps. They carried scanners that pulsed with a harsh red light. They were not looking for a boy. They were hunting a specific energy signature. The one Kale now carried within him. the one he had bound himself to. He saw them from his hiding place in the hollow of the ancient tree. He saw Ira step out from behind a ruined wall. She did not run. She stood tall. Her skin shifted through blues and purples, a final, defiant display of her nature. Two agents seized her. Their grip was impersonal, mechanical. They clamped restraints on her wrists. The material glowed with a dull orange light, and she flinched. The vibrant colors of her skin muted to a flat, painful gray. They began to drag her toward a waiting transport. Her head turned. Her silver eyes found Kale's hiding place. There was no panic in them. Only a fierce, urgent command. A message sent not with words, but with a look he felt in his soul. Hide, survive, return. He wanted to run out. To scream, to fight. But her warning held him frozen. The weight of the Starbound vow was a cold knot in his chest. It was a tether, but also a chain. It demanded he obey her last instruction. He watched them force her into the transport. The ramp closed. The ship ascended, its engine screaming into the yellow sky. It vanished into the haze, taking her with it. The jungle was left silent, dead. He made it back to the colony perimeter, his clothes smelling of chemicals and fear. He slipped through the fence just as a familiar figure rounded the corner. His father, Damon Arden, stood waiting. His face was stone. He was not in a patrol uniform. He wore the severe, unadorned garb of a senior compliance officer. He did not ask where Kale had been. He already knew. His eyes were cold, distant. He put a heavy hand on Kale's shoulder. The grip was firm, unyielding. "Listen to me," he said. His voice was low, devoid of warmth. "Forget what you saw in there. The Lunari are not your concern. They are a classified subject, an unstable element." His fingers tightened. The message was clear. Do not ask. Do not speak of it, ever. Then he delivered the final blow, a flat administrative fact that carved a hole in the world. They are marked for extinction anyway. The words held no emotion, no regret. It was a statement of policy, a done deal. The Empire had not just captured her. It had sentenced her, her entire species, to be erased. Like cleaning up a spill, Kale stood there. The warmth of the Starbound vow in his chest felt like a lie, a childish fantasy crushed under the boot of reality. His father turned and walked away, leaving him alone with the chemical wind. The betrayal was absolute. It was not just the agents in the jungle. It was the law. It was his own father. The very structure of the society he lived in was complicit in her destruction. He did not cry. He stored the image of her final look away, the command in her silver eyes. Hide, survive, return. He would follow that order. It was the only truth left. The Empire began its work of erasure. Scouts in environment suits moved into the jungle. They collected debris. They scanned for residual energy. They would log it all, file it. Then they would burn what was left. They would make it as if the Lunari had never been on Veridon 9, as if she had never existed. But she did exist. He could still feel her, a faint, cool ember in the back of his mind, a promise that the Empire's fire could not touch. The political brutality of the Triumvirate had been revealed in its full, unflinching cruelty. It had tested the Starbound vow against the full force of institutional power. The vow held. It was wounded, isolated, but it was not broken. A tiny, illegal light remained, waiting. Time passed. The boy from Veridon 9 became a man who worked in the dark between stars. His ship was the Wanderlark, a salvager-class vessel patched together from old parts. It was not built for comfort. It was built for endurance.
Kale Arden lived by improvisation.
He did not rely on established trade routes or imperial star charts. He went where the work was. He followed rumors of derelict freighters and forgotten outposts. He moved through the void like a ghost, picking the bones of dead ships. It was a solitary life, a practical one, but he was never truly alone. A ghost traveled with him. She appeared in his dreams with skin the color of twilight. Her silver eyes watched him from the shadows of his quarters when he woke. The memory of her was a constant presence, a quiet ache that never faded. It was not a loud haunting. It was a persistent one, like a low-grade fever. It lived in the back of his mind, a cool, distant star he could always feel if he concentrated. His only constant companion was the ship's AI, Hex, a sentient mining intelligence repurposed for navigation and systems management. Its voice was a flat, synthetic baritone that came from speakers in the walls. It noticed patterns. It calculated probabilities. It often commented on Kale's habits. Your heart rate and respiration show marked increase during sleep cycle 7, it would state. Neural scans indicate high-frequency recall of a humanoid form with blue epidermal pigmentation. The parameters of your obsession remain inefficient. Kale's quarters were a testament to that so-called obsession. The walls were not bare metal. They were covered in data slates and scrawled notes, fragments of a language he had spent 15 years trying to reconstruct. He had pieces of it. Phrases from the Starbound vow, words Era had taught him for star and tree and promise. He had cross-referenced them with obscure linguistic databases from dead civilizations. It was a patchwork, a map of possibilities leading nowhere and everywhere at once. At the center of it all was a drawing. Simple thing on aged glass paper. The lines were a child's. It showed a girl with long hair and star-filled eyes. He had drawn it from memory in the days after they took her. It was pinned above his bunk. It was his North Star, his silent answer to Hex's logic. Every jump, every salvage run, every decision was measured against that fixed point. He was always in some way moving toward it. Hex's analytical assessments could not dampen the pull. The AI could calculate the statistical impossibility of finding one specific individual in a galaxy of billions of star systems. It could list the numerous triumvirate regulations such a search would violate. It could not quantify the bond. The vow was a living thing inside him, a thread that had been quietly pulling for a decade and a half. It was a weapon he did not know how to use, a wound that would not heal. It was his deepest secret and his only truth. 15 years is a long time to carry a childhood promise. Most would have let it fade, dismissed it as a fantasy, a product of a lonely boy's imagination. Kale never did. He let the world believe he had moved on. He played the part of the pragmatic salvager, focused on credits and engine maintenance. But the promise was not dead. It was dormant, a seed planted in the ruins of a quarantined world, waiting for the right conditions to crack open and grow. It had survived betrayal, time, and the cold vacuum of space. It was the most alive part of him. Kale's days fell into a predictable rhythm. Wake, check ship systems, plot a course to the next salvage claim. His focus was on the immediate. Fuel levels, hull integrity, market prices for scrap metal and recovered data cores. He spoke in short, practical sentences. He avoided speculation. He was a man defined by actions, not memories. The past was a locked room. He did not go inside. The memory of Era was not gone. It was managed. It became a dull, persistent ache behind his sternum, a background noise to his life. He did not actively pursue leads on the Lunari. He did not query databases for sightings. He treated the feeling like an old injury, something you learn to work around. You favor the other side. You ignore the twinge when the weather changes. It was a suppressed thing. Hex's commentary was a constant. The AI's voice would echo through the corridor. Your biometrics indicate elevated stress markers. Perhaps you should power down and engage in a recreational activity. The mention of the blue-skinned ghost was a recurring theme. It was delivered with synthetic flatness, but the persistence of the observation suggested a layer of concern. A programmed attempt to engage with a persistent psychological anomaly. Kale's response was always the same. A grunt, a change of subject. A command to run a new diagnostic on the thrusters. He built walls, thick, high walls. He treated the childhood promise as a fantasy, a story a lonely boy had told himself to survive a trauma. It was easier that way, safer. To acknowledge the Starbound vow as real was to acknowledge a debt that could never be repaid, a quest that would consume his life. It was a path that led directly into conflict with the entire triumvirate apparatus. He had chosen survival, a quiet life in the margins. The promise was a dream. Dreams were not for men who lived on the edge of vacuum. He never spoke of the Lunari. If a newsfeed mentioned a triumvirate crackdown on unregistered species, he changed the channel. If a fellow salvager gossiped about rumors from the Veridon sector, he found work elsewhere. The destruction of Veridon 9's wilderness was a historical footnote to him. A closed chapter. He refused to remember the smell of chemicals or the look in his father's eyes. He refused to remember the weight of a small, cool hand in his, yet the evidence was all around him. His refusal was a performance for an audience of one. The walls of his bunk were papered with his contradiction. Notes in a flowing alien script were pinned next to wiring diagrams. Data slates filled with lunar language fragments sat beside spare parts. He was compiling a dictionary for a ghost. He was mapping the grammar of a dream. His hands worked on engine parts while his mind unconsciously traced the shape of words she had taught him. Star, promise, return. The internal conflict was a constant, low-grade war. His practical salvager's mind argued for the life he had. It was not a bad life. It was free. It was his. It was built on the principle of forgetting. His other self, the boy hidden deep inside, remembered the vow. It remembered the fusion of energy, the certainty of that connection. That part of him knew the promise was not a fantasy. It was a destination. The conflict grew with every silent year. The practical need to survive was slowly losing ground to the destined need to fulfill a contract written in starlight. The walls he had built were beginning to crack from the inside out. The comms panel flared to life on its own. A low, garbled hiss filled the cockpit, cutting through the steady hum of the Wanderlark's engines. It was not a standard distress call, not a trade beacon. The frequency was an outlaw band, one used by smugglers and fugitives to avoid Imperial monitoring. Static cracked and popped. Then a voice broke through. It was faint, distorted by distance and interference, but the language was unmistakable. Hex's voice came first, a flat tone from the overhead speakers. Incoming transmission on encrypted frequency 0970. Signal source is indeterminate. Linguistic analysis suggests a non-triumvirate dialect. Probability of random noise is 87%. The AI processed the sounds. It broke them into phonemes. It compared them to its vast linguistic databases. It could identify the structure as language, but the meaning was a cipher. Translation protocols are inactive. No known reference for this syntax. Kale was halfway across the cockpit, a tools kit in his hand. He froze. The words were not just sounds, they were shapes he knew. They were a ghost from his bones. The voice, warped as it was, pulled a memory to the surface with the force of a gravity well. He knew the rhythm, the cadence. It was the same melody she had taught him in the jungle. It was the lunar eye tongue. The signal stabilized for a moment. The distortion cleared. A single phrase rang out clean and sharp. The words were ancient, sacred. They were not a memory. They were a broadcast. Across the void beyond time's measure, he said the words aloud a fraction of a second after they were transmitted. His voice was a whisper, a reflex. The Starbound incantation. The vow he had spoken 15 years ago. It was being spoken back to him. Not from his mind. From a speaker. Across light years. The childhood promise was no longer a static thing. It was not a picture on a wall or a feeling in his chest. It was a signal. A living beacon. It pulsed with intent. It was a call. A deliberate transmission sent into the dark, aimed at one specific receiver. Him. It was proof. Solid empirical proof that defied all his rationalizations. She was alive. Somewhere in the vastness, Era was alive and she was calling him. The bond, that quiet, dormant thread inside him, reacted. It pulled. It was a physical sensation, like a wire hooked behind his sternum being drawn taut. The cool ember of her presence in his mind flared into a warm, insistent glow. It had direction now, a vector. The vow was no longer a relic. It was a navigation point. It was active, communicative. It was not asking. It was demanding a response. It was shattering 15 years of careful denial. Hex continued its analysis, oblivious to the seismic shift in the man standing rigid in the center of the room. Signal contains a repeating harmonic pattern. It may be a navigational marker, though its origin point is untraceable with our current astrometric data. The AI saw math. Kale saw a lifeline. The transmission was everything he had refused to hope for. It was a voice from the grave the triumvirate had tried to dig. It was a challenge to the Empire's official story. It was a personal summons. The childish fantasy was real. The debt was owed. The quiet life of survival was over. The imperative to act was no longer internal. It was blasting through his speakers, pulling at the very core of his being. The search was no longer a choice. It was the only possible course. The signal did not fade. It became a fixed point in the ship's audio logs, a repeating loop of ancient words that hung in the air of the cockpit. It forced his hand. There was no more room for denial. The bond was not a memory. It was a current reality, a line strung taut across the galaxy, connecting him to a living person. He could feel it now, a constant gentle pull behind his ribs. a compass needle pointing toward a destination he had spent half his life trying to forget. He sat in the pilot's chair and listened to the words. 15 years of carefully constructed walls began to crumble. The laws had not changed. The galactic triumvirate's stance on the Lunari was clearer than ever. Updated bulletins scrolled across a secondary screen. They were still classified as an endangered species, a biological and cultural contaminant. Contact was forbidden. Aiding them was a capital offense. The penalty for harboring one was imprisonment or worse. The Empire's reach was long. Its enforcers were thorough. To go after her was to declare himself an enemy of the state. It meant abandoning the safety of the margins. It meant stepping into the light where every authority would be hunting him. Hex processed the new directive. The AI ran the numbers. It presented the data on the main viewer. The probability of locating a specific individual based on a single anomalous signal was 0.004%. The probability of successful extraction from a presumed high-security triumvirate facility was 0.01%. The probability of surviving the ensuing manhunt was statistically negligible. Fuel costs would exceed any possible salvage value. The mission parameters were, by every measurable metric, a catastrophic failure before it even began. The AI's conclusion was a flat synthetic tone. This course of action is illogical. It contradicts all established protocols for survival. Kale's hands rested on the console. His knuckles were white. The salvager's mind, the one that had kept him alive for 15 years, argued with cold, hard facts. It listed the rational choices. Delete the signal. Plot a course to the next mining claim. Focus on the tangible, the achievable. It was the voice of the man who had survived by forgetting. But beneath it, another voice spoke. It was younger. Certain. It held the memory of crystalline trees and a hand that shifted colors. It remembered the warmth of a vow that had fused his soul to another. That voice did not deal in probabilities. It dealt in promises. The two parts of him warred in the silence of the ship. The adult who understood consequence. The child who understood truth. The signal kept playing. The vow kept pulling. The conflict was a pressure in his skull. He looked at the numbers on the screen. He looked at the old faded drawing pinned to the bulkhead. He felt the impossible tug of the bond. Logic pointed toward a long, quiet life of running. The vow pointed toward a probable violent death. But it was a death with meaning. He finally spoke. His voice was low. It cut through the hum of the ship and the AI's silent calculations. He was not talking to Hex. He was stating a fact to the universe. I made a promise 15 years ago. The words hung in the air, simple, final. The refusal was over. The internal war was won. The practical salvager stepped aside. The man who kept his word took the helm. The destined path was no longer an abstract idea. It was a course heading. He entered the coordinates Hex had extrapolated from the signal's harmonics. The navigation console lit up. The Wanderlark turned, its engines building to a steady, determined hum. The journey back had begun. The signal led them to the edge of known space. The star charts called it the maelstrom. It was not a storm of matter, but of distorted physics. Space-time itself was fractured there. The view from the cockpit was not the clean black of the void. It was a swirling vortex of muted colors. Deep purples and bruised yellows twisted together in a silent, chaotic dance. Light did not travel in straight lines. It bent, it bled. Stars at the edge of the distortion field smeared across the viewport like wet paint. The Wanderlark systems began to fail one by one. The long-range scanners flickered and died first. They returned nonsense data. Readings of massive solid objects where there was only void. Then the gravimetric sensors overloaded. The inertial dampeners strained against forces that had no clear direction. The ship shuddered. It was a deep, unsettling vibration that ran through the deck plates and into the bones of the crew. Physical laws became suggestions, unreliable. The ship's chronometer began to run backward, then forward at double speed. Time itself was coming unglued. Hex's voice was a constant stream of alerts. It sounded different. The usual flat synthetic tone was layered with a new tension, a subtle edge of processing strain. Navigation systems offline. Causality violations detected in local space-time. External sensors report impossible structures. The AI was reporting nightmares. It described architecture that could not exist. Towers that folded in on themselves. Bridges that spanned gaps in reality. It was a geometry of madness. A fortress of non-Euclidean design lay at the heart of the storm. The scanner could not get a clear image. The structure seemed to shift, to breathe. It was built from a dark, organic-looking material that pulsed with a slow, rhythmic light. It was alive in a way that metal and stone should not be. This was the Triumvirate's darkest secret, a prison built not just in a remote location, but outside the normal bounds of physics, a place to hide things they never wanted found. The energy required to maintain such a distortion field was immense, unthinkable. It spoke of a power source beyond any conventional technology. It was the perfect prison. No one could find it by accident. No one could escape it by design. The laws of the universe itself conspired to keep its secrets contained. Kale's hands were steady on the controls. The pull of the Starbind vow was a sharp, clear line in his mind. It cut through the chaos of the sensors. It was the only true north left. He ignored Hex's escalating warnings. He overrode the safety protocols. The ship was not built for this. It was a salvager, a workhorse. It was meant for the quiet places, not the screaming edge of reality. He pushed the thrusters forward. The ship moved into the swirling colors. The groaning started immediately. It was a deep metallic protest from the ship's frame. Stressed welds shrieked. The hull plating vibrated like a struck bell. Pressure readings spiked into the red all across the board. The sound was that of a living thing in pain. The Wanderlark was being subjected to forces it was never designed to withstand, forces that should have torn it into microscopic pieces. The viewport blurred. The swirling colors outside resolved into something else. For a moment he saw it clearly. The fortress. A monstrous breathing construct of shadow and sickly light. It was real. It was waiting. There was no turning back now. The point of no return was not a line on a chart. It was the moment the ship crossed the threshold into the storm. The laws of physics closed behind them like a door slamming shut. The only way was through. The only direction was forward into the heart of the madness toward the faint, cool pulse of a promise made 15 years before. The ship groaned again, a long, drawn-out sound of tortured metal, and pressed on. The heart of the Nexus was a brutal machine. It was not built for containment. It was built for consumption. In the central chamber, a web of glowing orange cables hung from the high ceiling. They pulsed with a slow, rhythmic light. At their center, suspended in the air, was Era. The cables were not restraints. They were siphon lines. They pierced her skin at the wrists, the temples, the base of her spine. A visible current of energy, a pure white light, flowed from her body into the lines. It was her life force, her very essence, being drained away. Her skin, once a shifting tapestry of blues and purples, was a pale, washed-out gray. The star-like patterns on her arms were faint, like faded ink. She was conscious. Her head was bowed. Her body was limp in the grip of the energy harness. She was a battery, a renewable power source for the Triumvirate's most secret operations. The fortress around them, the reality-bending field of the Maelstrom, it all ran on this. On her, on the systematic theft of a Lunari's soul. 3 figures stood guard at the chamber's perimeter. They were the Dread Hunters. They did not move. They were monuments of fused biology and machinery. Their forms were bipedal, but that was where humanity ended. Their limbs were encased in segmented black armor that seemed to breathe. Organic muscle, slick and dark, was visible at the joints. Their faces were featureless plates of polished metal, reflecting the grim scene in distorted miniature. They carried no visible weapons. Their hands ended in long, articulated claws that looked like they could shear through plating. They were the Empire's ultimate hunters, designed to track, to capture, to neutralize. They were the reason no one escaped this place. Her suffering was a physical weight in the air. It was a cold, draining sensation that pressed down on everything. Yet she was not broken. A faint, cool ember still glowed within her. It was the Starbind connection, the thread that bound her to Kale. It was the only thing sustaining her, feeding a tiny part of her spirit that the machines could not touch. It was a whisper in the dark, a reminder of a promise. This fortress was the Triumvirate's final argument. It was the ultimate expression of their policy. They did not just want the Lunari gone. They wanted to use them up, to harness their unique energy until there was nothing left. Their peaceful nature, their psychic gifts were not respected. They were exploited, turned into a utility, a resource to be mined. This was the cost of her people's persecution. Not just death, desecration. Cale saw it all from the shadow of a maintenance conduit. The sight was a physical blow. The girl from the jungle, the being of light and grace, reduced to this, a component in a cruel machine. The abstract injustice he had learned about as a boy was now a concrete, horrifying reality. The Empire's oppression was not a historical fact. It was a current event happening in front of him. It had a face. Her head lifted slightly. Her silver eyes found his in the gloom. They were dimmed. The galaxies within them were clouded with pain and exhaustion, but they were not empty. They held a desperate hope. A recognition. She had been waiting. For 15 years she had been holding on to that thin, impossible thread, believing it would lead him here. Her look was not a plea for mercy. It was an affirmation. A silent "I knew you would come." The rescue was no longer a mission. It was not about fulfilling a childhood vow or defying imperial law. It became something deeper, more visceral. It was personal. It was a righteous fury, cold and hard as diamond. This was not just about saving her. It was about tearing this entire monstrous machine apart with his bare hands. The galactic oppression had a name. It had a location, and he was standing inside it. The fight was no longer out there. It was right here, in this room. He freed her from the energy harness. The contact of his hand on her arm was the catalyst. The moment their skin touched, the Starbound connection flared to life. It was not a memory. It was a circuit completing after 15 years of silence. The energy that flowed between them was immense. It was the accumulated power of a vow held in stasis, now released. The air in the chamber crackled with it. The orange glow of the siphon lines flickered. The fortress itself seemed to recoil. They turned to the core of the machine. The central console was a mass of crystalline nodes and pulsing conduits. It was the heart of the energy web, the system that held her captive. Their combined will focused on it. But the web resisted. It was not just technology. It was a living system fed on stolen power. It pushed back. A wave of force erupted from the console, throwing them backward. The energy was hostile, alien. It was designed to consume, not to be challenged. Era's voice was weak but clear. She spoke the first words of the incantation, the ancient vow. Cale's voice joined hers. They spoke in unison. Their words synced perfectly across the years. Two souls entwined, a sacred treasure. The phrase was not a memory. It was a key. The sound of their joined voices resonated with the fundamental frequency of the bond. It was a vibration the machine could not process. The reality within the chamber twisted. The walls blurred. The hard lines of the console softened like melting wax. Their combined power became a feedback loop. The energy the triumvirate had stolen from her now reversed its flow. The white light that had been draining from her body surged back through the siphon lines. It was a violent return. The cables glowed white-hot. They vibrated, then began to snap one by one with sounds like cracking ice. The power was not just returning to her. It was flooding back. It was a tidal wave of reclaimed energy. The fortress could not withstand the backlash. The feedback was anathema to its twisted design. Cracks appeared in the organic walls. They spread like black lightning. The floor shuddered. A deep groaning sound echoed through the structure, the sound of a living thing dying. The reality-bending field that held the maelstrom together began to destabilize. The nightmare geometry of the place started to unravel. Color returned to Era's skin. The washed-out gray was replaced by a deep, vibrant blue. It shifted into rich purples. The star patterns on her arms blazed with new light. Her form straightened. The weakness fell away. Her silver eyes cleared. The galaxies within them burned with restored intensity. She was no longer a prisoner. She was a Lunari at full power, a being of light and purpose. The three dread hunters, motionless until now, activated as one. Their featureless metal faces swiveled toward the source of the disruption. The facility's collapse had triggered their final programming. Containment had failed. The threat level was catastrophic. Their primary function shifted from guard to termination. They moved forward. Their movement was not a walk. It was a smooth, predatory glide, their clawed hands extended. The polished surfaces of their faces reflected the crumbling room and the two figures standing at its center. The bond was no longer a quiet thread. It was a weapon. It was a shared consciousness, a pooled strength. They did not need to speak to coordinate. Cale knew her intentions as she knew his. He moved to intercept the closest hunter. his movements augmented by her flowing grace. She directed a pulse of pure energy at the second. Her power now under her own control, the supernatural connection they had created as children, had become their greatest asset. It was a force the triumvirate had never accounted for. It was not technology. It was not magic. It was a promise kept across time, and it was tearing their prison apart. The deep groaning of the fortress intensified, becoming a continuous roar. Cracks widened in the walls, spilling a harsh white light into the corridors. Chunks of the ceiling began to shear away, crashing to the floor in explosions of black organic material. The entire structure was tearing itself apart from the inside. The feedback from the reclaimed energy was too much for its unstable design. Simultaneously, a synthesized voice cut through the chaos from Kale's wrist comm. Hex's tone was stripped of all its usual flatness. It was pure data stream, urgent and clipped. Catastrophic structural failure detected. Gravimetric collapse imminent. Initiating emergency extraction protocol. On the exterior of the dying fortress, the Wanderlark fired its maneuvering thrusters. The ship pivoted, aligning its main dorsal airlock with a crumbling section of the outer wall. It was a dangerous precision move. The ship held its position mere meters from the disintegrating surface. Kale and Era ran. The floor tilted violently beneath them. Machinery sparked and exploded from overloaded conduits. The air filled with smoke and the smell of burning ozone. They moved as one unit, their movements synced by the Starbound bond. He knew where she would step. She anticipated his turns. They did not need to speak. The path back to the ship was a nightmare of shifting geometry. Corridors terminated in dead ends. Walls melted and reformed. Behind them, the three dread hunters gave pursuit. They were not deterred by the collapse. They adapted. They moved through the chaos with an uncanny liquid grace. One climbed along a collapsing ceiling, its claws digging into the fracturing material. Another simply phased through a wall that dissolved into nothingness. They were relentless. Their programming had one objective: prevent the asset's escape. The crumbling environment was just another variable in their hunt. They reached the breach. The section of wall Hex had targeted was a jagged hole open to the void. Beyond it, the Wanderlark's airlock yawned open, its interior lights a stark contrast to the hellish glow of the dying fortress. The ship held its position, but it was being buffeted by massive energy waves bleeding from the structure. The gap between the crumbling edge and the airlock was a 3-meter chasm of open space. Kale shoved Era forward first. She leaped, her form cutting a clean arc across the gap. She landed inside the airlock and turned immediately, her hand outstretched. He jumped after her. As he flew through the void, a metal claw scythed through the space where he had just been standing. One of the hunters had reached the edge. It made no move to jump. It simply watched, its featureless face reflecting their escape. The airlock doors slammed shut the instant his boots hit the deck. The welcome aboard chime was drowned out by the scream of overstressed metal. Hex's voice came through the internal comm, strained but controlled. Gravitational singularity forming at the facility's core, executing emergency burn. The ship's main engines fired at full power. The force punched them into the bulkheads. The view on the monitor showed the nightmare fortress. It contorted. It folded in on itself. It collapsed from a massive structure into a single, infinitely dense point of darkness. Then it was gone. The space it had occupied was just empty void. The violent shaking of the ship ceased. The screaming of the hull faded to the normal, steady hum of the engines. The swirling, chaotic colors of the maelstrom outside the viewport smoothed into the familiar, steady black of normal space. Hex's voice returned to its familiar, flat cadence. "We are clear of the maelstrom. All systems returning to nominal parameters. Space-time metrics have stabilized. They were safe. They had escaped total annihilation by a margin of seconds. It was not a victory of force, but of perfect coordination. The AI's flawless timing, the unspoken trust of a leap into the void, the bond that made two people move as a single organism. They had not fought their way out. They had executed a precise, desperate maneuver and won. The cost of failure had been absolute. The reward was a sliver of clean, quiet space and a second chance. The hum of the Wanderlark's engine settled into a steady, comforting rhythm. The insanity of the maelstrom was behind them, replaced by the quiet void of normal space. Era stood beside Kale at the cockpit's viewport. Her skin held its deep, shifting blues and purples. The star patterns on her arms glowed with a soft, steady light. She had been silent since their escape, her gaze fixed on the stars. Finally, she turned. Her silver eyes met his. They were clear now. The galaxies within them held a calm, deep certainty. "You kept your promise," she said. Her voice was quiet. It was not a question. It was a fact. A statement of something that had been inevitable from the moment a boy spoke a vow in a dying jungle. The personal triumph was real. He had defied the entire galactic order to find her, but the air in the cockpit did not feel like an ending. It felt like a beginning. The weight of what they had done settled around them. It was heavier than any cargo. The vow was no longer just a thread between two people. It was a symbol, a precedent. She looked away from him, back out at the field of stars. "The triumvirate's cruelty is not an isolated event," she said. "It is a symptom. My people are scattered, hiding, dying in silence. The galaxy is broken along the lines of species and fear." Her words were not filled with anger. They were filled with purpose. A calm, determined resolve. She revealed the true depth of her vision. It was not only about her own freedom. It was about creating a new structure, a network of safe havens for the displaced and the hunted, places where Lunari refugees could live without fear, where other species, marginalized by the triumvirate's rigid policies, could find shelter. Her people's legacy had been one of peacekeeping, of building bridges. That legacy could be reborn, not through mediation from on high, but through sanctuary from below. Their shared mission became clear in that moment. It was not a choice they debated. It was a path that unfolded before them. The Wanderlark would not return to salvage. It would become a lifeline, a mobile embassy of hope. The Starbound vow had begun as a childish pledge of marriage, a fairy tale idea of two souls uniting. Now it evolved. It became a binding of many souls, a social contract written in action, not words. It was a promise to protect not just each other, but an entire idea. Their partnership was the key. He was human, a product of the very system they were now opposing. She was Lunari, the embodiment of what that system sought to destroy. Together they represented a new possibility, unity across the deepest divides. Their bond was living proof that connection could be stronger than classification, that loyalty could override law. They were not just a couple. They were a statement. The sanctuary movement needed this. It needed a face, a story. It needed leaders who had not just talked about defiance, but had lived it, who had broken into the Empire's most secure prison and torn it apart from the inside. Their combined skills were its greatest asset. His knowledge of the fringe worlds, his smuggling contacts, and his ability to operate outside the law. Her connection to the scattered Lunari clans, her understanding of interstellar politics and forgotten histories. The resolution was not a quiet retirement. It was a call to a much larger fight. The boy's fairy tale promise, made in innocence, had become a civilizational blueprint. It was a practical plan for a different kind of galaxy, one built on sanctuary instead of suspicion, on bonds instead of borders. The personal had become political. The vow had scaled. The ship turned, its new course not set for a hidden jungle but for the bleeding edge of a growing rebellion. The work was just beginning. The Wanderlark's hold was repurposed. Salvage gear was cleared out. In its place, they installed modular life support pods and medical bays. The ship's identity shifted. It was no longer a scavenger. It was a transport, a mobile safe house, a single point of light in a very dark sky. Its new cargo was not scrap metal. It was lives. Ira's connection to her people was not a list of coordinates. It was a whisper network, a psychic resonance that reached across the void. She could feel the faint echoes of other Lunari, their fear, their hiding, their slow fading. She directed the ship not with charts but with intuition, with the pull of a shared bloodline crying out in the dark. They found survivors in asteroid crevices, in the atmospheres of gas giants, in the forgotten holds of derelict stations. They were the scattered remnants of a broken culture. The survivors they found were often young. Many had been born after the Exodus. They had never known the Golden Age era described. They had no memory of peacekeeping vessels or respected ambassadors. Their entire lives had been fear and running. Their knowledge of their own heritage was fragments, stories told in hushed tones. They looked at Ira not just as a rescuer, but as a living artifact, a piece of the history they had been denied. They were not alone for long. Word spread on the outlaw channels, not through official bulletins, but through the quiet talk of mechanics and freight pilots. A human ship was picking up strays. It was breaking the quarantine laws. Others began to seek them out. An Actari engineer whose colony had been dissolved by imperial decree. A Siren medic exiled for treating non-sanctioned species. Their motives were different. Their need was the same. A place to be, safety. They began building more than a network. They built a philosophy. It was a simple, radical idea. That a person's worth was not defined by their species classification. That sanctuary was a right, not a privilege granted by the state. This idea transcended the old boundaries. It was a direct challenge to the triumvirate's core doctrine of separation and control. It was not delivered in speeches. It was demonstrated in action, one ship, one life at a time. The effort grew. One ship became 3, then 6. They were a ragged fleet, converted freighters and retrofitted scouts. They were not warships. They were arcs. Each vessel became a floating embassy, a symbol of the new alliance. They established hidden way stations on neutral planetoids, places where different species could meet without imperial oversight. They shared technology, medicine, stories. They were building the framework of a different kind of galaxy from the ground up. Hex monitored it all. The AI ran the numbers constantly. It calculated the probability of their continued evasion. It factored in triumvirate patrol density, resource scarcity, and the statistical likelihood of betrayal. The percentages were not good. The probability of long-term success remained in the single digits. The system was too large. The opposition was too powerful. The math was clear. This was a doomed enterprise. Kale and Era did not look at the numbers. They looked at the people. They saw the Actari engineer jury-rigging a life support system to save a Lunari child. They saw the Chiron medic teaching a human pilot about alien physiology. These were not statistical probabilities. They were facts. Bonds were forming. Trust was being built in the cracks of the empire. These connections were not a weakness. They were a strategic asset. The loyalty between crew members from different worlds created a cohesion that no imperial directive could match. It made their small fleet resilient, unpredictable. The math could not account for the tactical advantage of a promise kept, of a debt honored, of love in its various forms, making excellent decisions under pressure. They stood on a stone balcony overlooking the new sanctuary. The air was cool and carried the scent of alien blossoms. Below them, lights were coming on in the makeshift settlement. It was a fragile piece, a temporary haven carved out of a hostile galaxy. Era looked out at the settlement, then at Kale. Her silver eyes held the reflection of the distant stars. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked. Her voice was quiet. "The normal life you gave up?" "The safe one." The question hung between them. The tension was a live wire. The galaxy had not become a safer place. Triumvirate patrols still hunted for them. Their network of sanctuaries existed in the shadows. It was a constant calculation of risk and reward. Every new life they saved was a potential exposure. The threat was a constant pressure. A reality they managed but never escaped. Kale did not look away from the settlement. He watched the lights. "Normal life was never an option," he said. His voice was flat, certain. "Not after I met you." The statement was simple. It held no grand sentiment. It was a fact of his existence as true as the stars above them. The path of a quiet salvager had been an illusion, a waiting period. His real life began the moment he slipped through that fence on Veridon 9. Everything else was just marking time. Their shared incantation, the Starbound vow, was no longer a private thing. It had become a signal, a code used across their fledgling network, a phrase that meant safety and solidarity. It echoed through space on secured channels. It was a new measure of hope for those who had none. It was a password that opened doors instead of closing them. It was their greatest export. The guiding principle of their movement was a direct rejection of the old order. The Triumvirate's doctrine was built on separation, on the fear of difference. Theirs was built on unity, on the strength found in connection. They had replaced the goal of extinction with the practice of inclusion. It was not a philosophical stance. It was a practical one. They survived because they worked together. Species did not matter. Loyalty did. The vow itself continued to change. It was no longer just about two souls. It was a scalable concept, a social contract that could bind a crew, a settlement, an entire alliance. It was a promise of mutual protection, a commitment to stand together against the darkness. It was a bond that now held thousands of lives in its weave. It had grown from a child's whisper to the foundation of a resistance. It represented a choice. A conscious decision to value connection over security, to choose a difficult truth over an easy lie. The people in the settlement below had all made that choice. They had left behind the safety of the triumvirate's narrow world for the precarious hope of a wider one. They were bound not by law but by a shared belief in something better. They led from the front. Not from a position of removed authority but from alongside everyone else. Kale's knowledge of the fringe worlds and forgotten roots was their map. Ira's connection to the scattered threads of her people was their compass. Their partnership was the engine. The promise they had made to each other had become the promise they made to every soul they brought into the fold. It was a debt that expanded instead of diminishing. The galaxy was still a dangerous place. The work was never done, but on that balcony, looking out at the lights they had helped to kindle, the outcome felt certain. They were leading the way toward a different kind of future, one built on the enduring strength of a promise kept. The journey was long. The opposition was powerful, but the bond held. It would always hold. Some promises carry more weight than time or distance. They become anchors in the fabric of reality itself. The starbound vow between a boy and an alien girl proved that hope is a tangible force. It can outlast political oppression and defy the cold logic of extinction. Their bond became a blueprint for resistance, built on the simple act of keeping one's word. It shows that a single commitment, held with enough conviction, can eventually bend the arc of the galaxy. Let me know which part of their journey resonated most with you.